That's a float. It goes up when the fuel level goes up. That right there is a fuel pump. Goes inside the fuel tank. That's the output. You can see where you hook up to the 12 volts. That's another fuel pump. In fact, that's the same fuel pump, isn't it? Yeah, it's pretty freaking close. You got the red wire and the black wire, you know that's 12 volts. So this right here is the fuel level sender. You can see that that's a variable resistor. That's the sock that got ate up by all the alcohol and the other ones. Sock, this kind of a filter goes into the fuel pump, comes out of the fuel pump, goes over here. Okay, so it comes out of the fuel pump, where'd it go? The fuel filter is correct. Now you can tell because it says so right there. Yeah. Then we go to the fuel rail, which is this thing right here. And the fuel rail has all the injectors connected to it. Yeah, and then it goes to the injector, and the injector runs off how many volts? Gotta be 12. That's what we got. So the injector is going to run off 12, and the fuel pump's going to run off 12. The fuel pump's going to draw a lot more current. But anyway, that's what the injector looks like, and you see these two little things like this, and when we get 12 volts on the injector is going to open. And since the fuel is under pressure, when the injector opens, it's going to squirt fuel. Okay, well, what gave us fuel pressure?
Fuel pump.
Fuel pump is correct, thank you. Okay. So the fuel pump gives us pressure so that we can move the fuel from the gas tank to the engine where we use it, the gas tank where we store it, to the engine where we use it. We're going to throw it through a filter first before we go to the fuel rail, because we've got to make sure that the fuel injector has very small openings. So if you get a little bit of crap inside a fuel injector, now it's not going to work right. And the problem is, if this fuel injector is pumping out 75% of what that fuel injector is pumping out, your cylinders are not going to give equal power contribution, right? That's a problem. That's like feeding one horse 75% of the other, what the other one gets. It's going to make them cranky. Anyway, we're talking about fuel systems again today. Oh, well, we're talking about fuel systems again today. Actually, we're talking about making strides on the dually with the advanced class. This is why you got to draw this stuff as early as you can, as soon as you get here. Yeah, so, yeah, if it makes you feel any better, I asked the question, okay, how do I correct the problem with air-fuel ratio? And students are like, I don't know, change the pulse width. Change the pulse width. This is ignition systems, that's where we're going later. Not today, though. Yeah, I'll go like that. Ah! Gotta be more careful with my erasing. Anyways, how much fuel pressure you got? Well, the old system, gonna have a carburetor. That's old stuff. This is like what your lawnmower runs on. Carburetors. Carburetors were not electrical. And they weren't electrical because, first of all, we didn't have the mechanisms or the strategies to run the car electronically, but it was good enough. And, you know, back in the 40s or 50s, we didn't care. As long as it was good enough, carburetor was fine. It had no electrical. It was simple. It was mechanical. It's the same carburetor you got on your freaking lawnmower. And as a result, simple mechanics could understand it and fix it. And you didn't need any specialized test equipment because, after all, it was just the same mechanism you had on Grandpa's tractor or on your lawnmower. Okay, on the old system of the carburetor, we would expect 5 to 7 PSI. PSI meaning what?
Pounds per
Pounds
square
per
inch.
square inch is correct. Thank you. It's a measure of pressure. What creates fuel system pressure?
Fuel pump.
The pump is correct. Thank you. Good. Now we've got the first fuel injection. It's going to be throttle body injection, which is basically they had the exact same engine that took the carburetor. That's TBI. They took the same engine that took the carburetor, so it's got the same intake manifold, same everything. And what they did was they put a throttle body on top of it. Well, what's a throttle body?
Connected to the.
Around here we call it a cuerpo de mariposa. Because it looks like a butterfly fish, sort of. All kinds of stuff. Everything except the throttle body. Wheel. That's well mixed. There's a carburetor for you. Old thing from a million years ago. See, it doesn't have any place to hook up any wires. That's a fuel pump. That's a lovely fuel pump, actually. Big old rascal. How many volts does it run on?
12.
12 is correct. Every pump has a suction side and a pressure side, right? Thank you, sir. Find any throttle bodies? Yeah, me neither.
You had one, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, remember you showed us.
But I will, though. I assure you. There you go. Got it. All right. That beautiful thing right there, that's the throttle body. That's the throttle body. And what it does is it allows us to control the amount of air that gets inside the engine. And, you know, if we open up the throttle blades, there's going to be a lot more air. If the throttle blades are closed like this, the engine's going to run 650 to 800 RPM. That's idle speed. What's RPM? Revolutions per minute is correct. Thank you. So this is the throttle body, and this is what we use to control the airflow into the engine. Now, throttle body injection put the injector on top of the throttle body. It worked okay. Didn't work great, but what it did was it gave us some time because we knew that we were going to end up with port fuel injection. We knew we were going to end up with one injector per cylinder, but we didn't have the technology to control 6 injectors yet, so we just controlled 1 or maybe 2. That was throttle body injection. See, it was a lot simpler, and as a result, we didn't have to exceed our ability so hard while we were making the transition. However, since it was simpler, it wasn't as good. Which is why you don't see many throttle body injection cars around anymore, because people just got rid of them because they weren't happy with the way they worked. Like a carburetor, it's good enough, but it wasn't good enough for long. Anyway, throttle body injection, we would expect 15 to 35 psi. What creates fuel pressure?
Fuel pump.
Fuel pump is correct, thank you. So I'm gonna go ahead and erase this just for fun. And I'm gonna say port fuel injection. That means one injector per cylinder. Now I'm going to have one injector per cylinder, which means I'm going to have to control each injector individually, which means that's the highest level of computer control you can get, is to control each cylinder's fuel individually. So port fuel injection, I'm going to expect 35 to 75 psi. These right here. I'll go like that. Are called electronic fuel injection, which is EFI. There you go. And I believe the last thing we talked about was gasoline direct injection. We talked about trying to inject fuel into a cylinder that's already under significant pressure. That requires a whole lot more pressure. Because as we said, the delta, the difference between the injection pressure and the cylinder pressure, the higher the difference, the faster the flow is. And we don't have much time. Because what we want to do is we want to understand the four-stroke cycle enough to where we can understand what's going on with the injectors, for instance. Now, look, the fist is the piston. This is where it connects to the crankshaft, right? You got intake, compression, power, and exhaust, right? That's a four-stroke cycle. How many revolutions of the crankshaft?
Four.
Really? Watch the elbow. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. How many revolutions is that? 2. Okay, so in 2 revolutions on the crankshaft, we have all 4 strokes. This has been taught to you 6, 7, 8 times, folks. Why is your pencil not moving? Do you need to be reminded every freaking, you want me to remind you every 60 seconds what you're supposed to do? Is that what you're after? Is that what my job is? Is that what I'm here for? Yep. That's not what I'm here for. Yeah. Wonder why you're sad? Look at the way you run your life. You want to surround yourself in the warm blanket of your feelings? Obsessed with spending your day doing what losers do? Let's go. Let's go. Look, certain milestones will be expected of you at certain ages. And when 5 years from now you're still making $2 over minimum wage, that will be a milestone not met. And it'll be very, very hard to find anyone worth hanging out with that finds that attractive. Now, I guess you figure that doesn't matter much, but it matters a whole lot. More than you can imagine. There we go. So here's the thing. 3,000 RPM is how many times per second? What's RPM? Revolutions per minute. So that's crankshaft revolutions. So if the crankshaft is turning 3,000 times per minute, how many times is that per second?
50.
50. Why? Because you divide by 60. Yeah, so 3,000 divided by 60 equals 50. So 50 times a second that crankshaft is turning. That's basically highway speed. So 50 times a second that crankshaft is turning. Is that a lot? Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. As a result, you better change your oil. That's, I think, the lesson there. Better change your oil. 50 times a second, if you looked at it, would you be able to see the crankshaft turning? No, all you'd see is a blur. That's going twice as fast as a human eye can discern. Alright. Let's try this again. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. How many revolutions of the crankshaft?
Two.
Two. And we went through one 4-stroke cycle, 2 revolutions of the crankshaft, right? How many times did the injector fire? Once. That is correct, because it only fires on the intake stroke. How many times did the intake valve open? Once. How many times did the spark plug fire? Once. How many times did the exhaust valve open? Once. So these things only happen every other revolution, right? So, if we're going 3,000 RPM, that's crankshaft revolutions. If we're going 3,000 RPM, that's 50 times a second that the crankshaft turns. But the injector only fires on every other turn. So it only happens only 1,500 times per minute, which is 25 times a second, right? Half as often. 25 times a second. Now, if you looked at something that was happening 25 times a second, would you be able to see it? All you'd be able to see is a blur. So if you were looking at the injector or the intake valve or the spark plug or the exhaust valve, all you would see is a blur because the eye can't see much faster than 25 times a second. Now, how many milliseconds are there in a second? 1,000, because milli means 1,000th, right? Okay, so if something's happening 25 times a second, how big are the chunks of time between each event? Well, you would divide 1,000 by 25, which equals what? 1,000 divided by 25. If I asked you how many freaking quarters there were in a dollar, what would you tell me? 4. It starts with a 4, that's for sure. Yeah, it's 40. So, if something happens 25 times a second, that means it happens every 40 milliseconds. That's a very small piece of time. Would you be able to see that on a watch? No, it's the wrong instrument. You'd be able to see that on an oscilloscope, but you wouldn't be able to see it on a watch. You wouldn't be able to see it on a meter. Okay. So we're talking about very small, very, very small chunks of time. Which tells me you better change your oil. You know, keep your oil in good condition because this stuff's happening fast. And 3,000 RPM is not that fast. 3,000 RPM is basically freeway speed. Now, if you went to the red line, which is defined as the maximum engine speed you can do without worrying about the engine coming apart. That's closer to 6,000 RPM, so you can take all this stuff and just double it. At 6,000 RPM, the crankshaft is spinning 100 times a second. Is that a lot?
Yes.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. But see, that's why we're going to do math, because math is the only thing that's never going to lie to you. So math tells us at 6,000 RPM, divided by 60, that means the crankshaft turns 100 times a second. That's crazy. But that means that the injector fires 50 times a second. That's crazy too. And the spark plug fires 50 times a second, because these are all things that happen every other revolution, right? So the injector fires 50 times a second. The spark plug fires 50 times a second. The intake valve opens and closes 50 times a second. The exhaust valve opens and closes 50 times a second, which tells me you better freaking change your oil. Because the only thing that keeps the thing from coming apart is oil, right? And we've begun to see the problems caused by not changing your oil, but it's important to look at the challenges presented by engine operation so that you appreciate what your oil has to go through. And so you understand the importance of making sure that your your lubrication system is in top shape, and you keep it that way. All right. Well, the thing is, if the injector's firing 50 times a second, that means there's only 20 milliseconds between injector firings. That's extraordinarily fast. And you can begin to appreciate the amount of computer power that was necessary to get an engine where we could control it to this level. That's crazy. That's crazy stuff. And it took us a long time to get here. I mean, we had mechanical fuel injection back in the mid-60s. It was terrible and it didn't work very well, but we had it. We've been running mechanical fuel injection on big rigs forever. Now, are the modern big rigs using mechanical fuel injection still? No, they're all going to electronic fuel injection. They're all going to electronic fuel injection. Well, they've all been in electronic fuel injection for the longest, which means that the exact same stuff that we learn in terms of how cars work is also going to apply to big rigs, big diesels, all the engines really, which is very cool. Transferable skills is very, very cool. Okay, well, typical injector pulse within an idle, that's port fuel injection. Typical injector pulse within an idle is between 2 and 4 milliseconds. Right, because vehicles, air-fuel ratio is controlled on vehicles. We're going to shoot a little bit of fuel. It's going to bop off the piston and goes head straight for the spark plug. When it heads straight for the spark plug is going to have plenty of fuel around it. Spark plug's going to have plenty of fuel around it, so when the spark plug fires, you're going to get a big-ass explosion. But it's going to be in a small area. Okay. So what we can do now is, with our port fuel injector, we can put in way less fuel than we otherwise would, because after all, we don't have to make sure the whole freaking place is saturated. Now, there's a candle right there, right? Would it be easier to light it with the lighter or with a freaking blowtorch?
With the blowtorch?
Blowtorch.
Yeah, it's way easier to light with a blowtorch. Right, so what we're doing is, the spark plug fires on this little bit of fuel that came out of the direct injector, so now it's a freaking blowtorch. So now we can put way less fuel with the port fuel injector, we can put way less fuel in the cylinder, and we're going to get much more complete combustion, because now we're breaking up all these hydrocarbon molecules with a blowtorch instead of using a lighter. Get it? So as a result, we end up using a lot less fuel and getting the same results, except we're going to get the same power with less fuel, because again, we're lighting off all these hydrocarbon molecules with a blowtorch, but we're using less fuel, which means our fuel economy goes up, which means our emissions go down, which is the whole reason they're putting such an expensive system on your car anyway, is because they want the fuel economy to go up and the emissions to go down and the power to remain the same. And that's how we're doing it. It's a sophisticated system. It's more complicated and it's certainly more expensive, but it's going to get you those results. And now, at this moment, they think those results are worth the added expense. But I mean, it's going to add $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to the price of your new car. Worth it? Well, it is for them. I'm not sure it is for you, but I don't think you have much choice, because if you want a 2017 Corvette, they only came in one configuration. That's gasoline direct injection with port fuel injection on top of it. But that's what they're trying to accomplish. That's why we're at GDI now. Because everybody's doing it, because it works so much better than the old port fuel injection system. Again, the problem with the port fuel injection system is we had to dump a bunch of extra fuel into the cylinder just to get the spark plug to fire and give us adequate combustion. Well, the problem with dumping a bunch of extra fuel is you're going to have high CO emissions because your air-fuel ratio is bad. And you're going to have high HC emissions because you're going to have a whole bunch of unburnt fuel. HC and CO, that's bad. That's two of the three smog gases. That's bad. So they're doing GDI instead. It's more efficient. Typically, I'll just remind you, typically if something's more efficient, that just means it's going to cost more. Might cost less to operate, but it's going to cost more to buy in the first place. Now, will these GDI cars go 200,000 miles?
200,000. 250.
The engines probably will, but will it do 200,000 miles without replacing that expensive GDI pump? I'm not sure.
No about that.
They're not old enough yet for us to know, because you don't usually go 200,000 miles in 7 years. That'd be a lot of driving. But I mean, we'll see for the future. The engines will go 200,000 miles. I'm not sure the GDI pumps will. But that's what we're trying. That's what we're doing. And that's why the engines are significantly more sophisticated, but they're also more efficient. But that kind of explains how the system operates. The port fuel injection systems, if you give them 35, 75 PSI, they're fine, because they're going into a vacuum, which is actually going to help pull the fuel out of the injector, right? But GDI, it's going into a high pressure environment, which means it's got to be even higher pressure, and it doesn't have much time, which means it's got to be even higher pressure. If I have a fuel injector and I double the pressure, can't I cut the amount of time I leave it open in half and still get the same amount of fuel? I double the pressure, can't I open the fuel injector half as long and still get the same amount of fuel?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. All day long.
Okay,
All
well,
day long, baby.
then why don't I go to 350 and 750 PSI? What's the problem with high pressures? High pressures always tend to leak, right? I mean, the water pressure in your house is regulated between 15 and 80 PSI. Okay, well, if 80 PSI is good, why don't we do 800 PSI? Because you think your system leaks on 80 PSI, you should see it on 800. It's going to be 10 times more likely to leak. So we want pressure, just not too much. Whether it's water pressure in your house or fuel pressure in your car. That's the constant battle we're finding. I mean, it would be cool for the fireman if, you know, he had 80,000 PSI. You know, he could stay at the fire station and put out the fire, but that was a joke. But, I mean, the pump would cost, you know, 4 times as much. And you couldn't really go through the hose. The hoses would be blowing up all the time. You'd have to make the hoses out of super heavy, thick wall material. Now it'd be like way too much work to get it on and off the fire truck. So what we're doing is we're doing compromises. We're making choices. That's how it works. What else you need to know about fuel? Thanks, guys.